The bell above the cafe door gave its familiar soft jingle, blending with the low hum of an early morning playlist. It was 7:05 a.m., the same minute, every single day. And, right on cue, she walked in. Her name was Tessa Reed. She looked to be in her mid-30s, with sandy blonde hair usually pulled into a loose braid, the kind of face that looked gentle even when she wasn't smiling, and blue-gray eyes that always seemed a little lost. She wore a faded denim jacket over a beige sweater, jeans cuffed at the ankles, and old white sneakers that had seen better days. Behind the counter was Luke Carver, the owner of a small coffee shop tucked between a thrift store and a florist. He had the kind of quiet charm that didn't demand attention, late 30s, dark brown hair always slightly messy, a few freckles across his nose, and hands that still smelled faintly of roasted beans even after washing them. He didn't need to ask what she wanted anymore. He'd memorized her order long ago, a medium cappuccino with extra foam and a drizzle of honey on top, paired with a toasted bagel, no cream cheese, just butter. "Morning, Tessa," Luke greeted softly, setting the cup down before she even reached the counter. "Morning, Luke." Her smile was small but sincere. She always spoke gently, as if careful not to disturb the quiet comfort of the morning. She paid, picked up her drink, and headed straight for the corner table by the window, the one that caught the first sunlight of the day. There, she'd take out a small sketchbook, a dull pencil, and begin to draw. Every day was the same. She stayed exactly 45 minutes, always left her cup perfectly centered on the table, and disappeared through the door with a soft, "See you tomorrow." At first, Luke didn't think much of it. His cafe, Driftwood and Steam, got its fair share of regulars, students, office workers, retirees who came for gossip and pie. But something about Tessa stood out. The way she lingered before leaving. The way her eyes flickered to the door each time it opened, as though she hoped someone else might walk in. He told himself not to overthink it. He had enough to worry about. Business had been slow that fall, and keeping the cafe running felt like trying to hold sand in his hands. His last employee had quit, rent was creeping up, and he'd been living on caffeine and hope for weeks. Still, he never once thought about giving up. Driftwood and Steam was all he had left of his father, who'd helped him build the place before passing away 2 years ago. Maybe that was why he noticed loneliness in others so easily. One quiet Tuesday, with the first frost glittering on the windows, Luke realized something unusual: Tessa hadn't touched her coffee. She just stared at it, lost in thought. The cafe was almost empty, so he walked over, wiping his hands on a towel. "Everything okay with the drink?" he asked gently. She blinked, startled, then smiled faintly. "Oh, no, it's perfect. I just zoned out for a second." "Long morning?" he asked. "Long year," she said softly, eyes dropping to her sketchbook. Luke hesitated. "Want a refill?" "On the house." She looked up, a little surprised. "You sure?" He nodded. "I figure you've earned one by being the most consistent customer I've ever had." That got a real smile from her. "Well, I wouldn't want to ruin my reputation." He laughed lightly and took her cup to the counter. As he refilled it, he couldn't help glancing at her sketchbook left open on the table. Most of it was filled with drawings of streets, benches, faces, and cafes, but one small sketch caught his eye. It was of his cafe. The counter. The coffee cups stacked neatly. Even his chalkboard sign, drawn in perfect detail. When he brought her drink back, he said, "You're really good." She looked startled. "You saw?" "Sorry. Couldn't help it," he admitted. "You made this place look better than it is." "It's not just the place," she said quietly. "Sometimes it's the feeling." He didn't fully understand what she meant then. But he nodded, smiled, and let her be. That night, after closing, Luke thought about her words. About how she came every day and always sat alone. He wondered if anyone else noticed her at all. The next morning, before opening, he added something small, a tiny wildflower in a glass jar, on her usual table. It wasn't fancy, just something he found near the park on his walk in. When Tessa arrived, she paused at her seat, eyes softening. "You did this?" she asked, looking at him. He shrugged lightly. The table looked empty. Figured it needed a little color. "Well," she said with a smile that reached her eyes this time, "thank you. It's lovely." That day, she drew longer than usual. Luke noticed her humming faintly while sketching, something he'd never seen before. Over the next few mornings, it became a quiet ritual. Sometimes he'd leave a handwritten note with a quote. Other days, he'd add a doodle on her cup sleeve. Once, he simply wrote, "Hope today feels lighter than yesterday." And every time, Tessa smiled a little more. A week later, she finally asked, "Do you do this for all your customers?" He smirked. "Only the ones who look like they could use it." Her eyes softened. "Then I guess I've looked that way for a while." He set down his towel. "Mind if I sit for a bit?" She nodded. "Sure." He sat across from her, resting his forearms on the table. "You an artist full-time?" Tessa shook her head. "Used to be a designer at a small ad agency. Got laid off in August. I thought I'd use the free time to paint again, but it's been hard to start. So I come here. Feels less empty." Luke nodded slowly. "I get that. I opened this place to feel connected. Turns out running a cafe can be one of the loneliest jobs in the world." She gave a small laugh. "You don't seem lonely." "I'm good at hiding it," he said simply. Something shifted in her eyes, understanding. "You ever think maybe people like us just need a reason to keep showing up?" He looked at her thoughtfully. "Maybe this cafe's been mine. Maybe you found yours too." They both smiled, a quiet kind of smile that said more than words could. From that morning on, their connection deepened. She began to stay longer, helping him rearrange the chalkboard menu or recommending pastries. He'd try out new coffee blends just so she could taste them first. They shared stories, about parents they missed, plans that had fallen apart, and small victories that still mattered. Luke started to look forward to mornings again, not for the sales, not for the routine, but for her. Then one Monday, she didn't come. At first, he thought she might be late. Then 30 minutes passed. Then an hour. The bell above the door stayed silent. He poured her usual cappuccino anyway and set it by the window, hoping she'd walk in. But she didn't. The chair sat empty. The flower he'd placed that morning looked oddly out of place. And for the first time in months, Luke realized what it meant to miss someone you didn't really know, but somehow knew completely. He glanced toward the window, exhaling softly. "Where are you, Tessa?" he murmured. He had no idea that the answer would lead him down a path that would change both of their lives forever. The next morning, Luke unlocked the cafe doors at 6:30, just like always. The sky outside was pale and cold, a heavy gray that seemed to press down on the quiet street. He turned on the lights, brewed the first pot of coffee, and waited. By 7:05, her chair by the window was still empty. He told himself she'd just overslept. Maybe she wasn't feeling well. But as the minutes ticked past, that familiar chime of the door never came. Her cup sat untouched on the counter, the foam slowly fading. For the first time since she'd started coming, driftwood and steam felt painfully silent. By 9, he gave up pretending she was just late. Something in his gut told him this wasn't like her. Tessa didn't miss mornings, not her kind of mornings. He grabbed his jacket, flipped the sign to "Be right back," and stepped out into the cold. He didn't even know where she lived. The only clue he had was a small local art studio business card she'd once left behind by accident. It was folded into her sketchbook one morning, and when he'd handed it back, she'd smiled and said, "That place is my therapy." Now, that card was all he had. The studio was about 10 blocks away, tucked between a record shop and an antique store. He pushed open the door, greeted by the faint smell of oil paint and wood shavings. A young woman behind the counter looked up. "Hey there," Luke said, trying not to sound nervous. "I'm looking for Tessa Reed. She comes here sometimes, I just wanted to make sure she's okay." The woman's face softened immediately. "Oh. You must be Luke." He blinked. "She mentioned me." "She talks about that cafe of yours a lot," the woman said with a small smile. "She said it's the only place that makes her mornings feel normal again." Luke's chest tightened. "So she's okay?" The woman hesitated. "She hasn't been in for a few days. Last I heard, her dad had another surgery. She's been taking care of him full-time since August. He's been in and out of the hospital for months." That explained so much. The tiredness in her eyes. The quiet way she carried herself. The grief that never seemed to leave her. Luke exhaled slowly. "Do you know where she lives? I just want to drop something off. Coffee, maybe." The woman nodded, scribbled an address on a scrap of paper, and handed it to him. "Tell her we're thinking of her too." He thanked her, tucked the note into his jacket pocket, and headed out. The address led him to a small, worn-out apartment complex on the east side of town. The building was old but cared for, potted plants on balconies, wind chimes that swayed in the cold wind. He climbed the narrow stairs to the third floor and knocked softly on her door. No answer. He waited, then knocked again. After a moment, he heard faint footsteps and the click of a lock. The door opened a few inches, and there she was, Tessa, hair tied messily, eyes ringed with exhaustion. "Luke?" she asked, surprised. He smiled awkwardly, holding up a coffee cup and a small paper bag. "I thought maybe you could use breakfast." For a second, she just stared at him, then her expression softened into something fragile and grateful. She opened the door wider. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," he said gently. "But I wanted to." Inside, her apartment was small but warm. Paintings lined the walls, some finished, some half done. In the corner sat an oxygen tank and a recliner chair where an older man rested, thin and pale but peaceful, eyes closed. "My dad," Tessa whispered. "He had a bad night. I didn't want to leave him alone." Luke nodded quietly. "You don't have to explain." She gestured toward the couch. "You can sit if you want." He did, setting the bag and coffee on the table. "How long's he been sick?" "Almost 2 years," she said softly, sitting across from him. "He used to run a small auto shop before the lung problem started. I moved back in to help him. Some days are good, some," she trailed off, her voice cracking slightly. "Some aren't." Luke looked at her for a long moment. "You shouldn't have to go through that alone." Tessa smiled weakly. "That's the thing about caregiving. Everyone thinks you're strong. But some days, you just feel invisible." He nodded slowly. "Yeah. I know that feeling." They sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the faint hum of the heater. Then she looked at him with teary eyes and said, "That cafe, it's been the one part of my day that still felt like mine. When I sit by that window, I almost forget for a little while." Luke felt his throat tighten. "You don't know what that place became for me either," he said. "It's been hard keeping it alive. Most mornings, I open the door and wonder if I'm just fooling myself. But when you started coming, it made the place feel worth it again." Tessa smiled through her tears. "Guess we've both been saving each other without realizing it." They both laughed quietly, the kind of laugh that breaks the heaviness for a moment. Luke stayed for an hour, helping her brew another pot of coffee, talking about everything and nothing. "Before leaving," he said, "take care of your dad. But when you're ready, the cafe's still there." "So am I." She nodded, eyes glistening. "I'll come back soon." And she did. 2 days later, the bell above the door chimed again. When Luke looked up, she was standing there, holding 2 cups of coffee this time. "One for you," she said, smiling softly. "You never get to sit down." He chuckled. "I guess I don't." She joined him at the counter, and for the first time, they drank together, not as barista and customer, but as 2 people who had finally found what they'd both been missing. From that day on, Tessa didn't just come to the cafe every morning, she became part of it. She helped paint new art for the walls, introduced local artists to display their work, and sometimes ran the counter when Luke needed a break. The cafe began to fill with laughter again, with people who stayed longer, who talked, who connected. And it wasn't long before others noticed that the place felt different, warmer somehow. Months passed. Tessa's father passed peacefully that spring, and though the grief was heavy, she didn't face it alone. Luke was there, every morning, every quiet evening, reminding her that sometimes, even in loss, life finds new beginnings. One late summer morning, as sunlight spilled through the windows, Tessa looked around the busy cafe and smiled. "You know," she said, "I used to think coming here was just a routine. Now I realize it was fate." Luke smiled, wiping down the counter. "Yeah. Sometimes loneliness brings the right people together." She reached over, touched his hand gently, and said, "And sometimes, it gives us a reason to stay." Outside, the morning bustle carried on as usual. But inside driftwood and steam, 2 souls who had once sat alone found that the simplest act, sharing a cup of coffee, had quietly changed both of their worlds forever.